It's got passed on in a lot of books. And as sometimes happens, has been passed on. This got accepted as fact. The Parliament never did anything of the sort. There's no lacrosse has no status as Canadians' national sport. Canada, in any official sense, does not have a national sport. In reality, anybody who knows anything about Canada knows that the national sport of Canada is hockey, in any normal sense. Why? Because Canadians treat it, Canadians think of it. And if Parliament had got together and said that lacrosse was a national sport, it wouldn't really make any difference. Canada's national sport is hockey because Canadians think of it that way, and it's important to them. It's very important to them. If Parliament gets together and says that the national butterfly is something, then most people are going to go, well, okay, that's fine. But a pastime is important, and things that are sort of, that we think of as our symbols are important. And so a lot of times now I hear people will say, well, football has really surpassed baseball in popularity, and it's become the national pastime. And to me, that's a complete non sequitur. That's like saying, well, Miley Cyrus is on top of the charts right now, so that's the national anthem. No, a national symbol is important. You know, we have equality as a symbol. That's important to us. That was important to us. It doesn't just go away because something else has a temporary increase in popularity. Baseball became the national pastime, was recognized as a national pastime in the 1850s, solidified that status in the 1860s, was universally thought of as the national pastime for most of the 20th century. And now a few people are coming along saying, well, yeah, football really is popular and so on. And it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way because a national pastime is more important. Similarly, the other top-down way that we tend to think with baseball is who invented it. And I'm certainly not going to go through Abner Doubleday. I'm sure that anyone here who's been interested in it knows that Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball. But what I want to point out is that as Abner Doubleday has been discredited as the inventor of baseball, the sort of natural reaction has been to say, well, if Abner Doubleday didn't invent baseball, then somebody else must have. And so people have said, well, Alexander Cartwright must have invented baseball, even though there's almost as little evidence for that as Doubleday. And, you know, even good historians, I mean, I've kind of gone down this road in my book. Some have said, well, if Cartwright didn't, then at least the Knickerbockers did. The Knickerbockers invented baseball. And the Knickerbockers had a hugely important role. They certainly, you can't write a history of early baseball without putting a lot of time into the Knickerbockers. But when you start saying they invented the game, that really fundamentally misrepresents their role. And to understand the kind of process that really happened, let me go through in some detail some of the debates that went through, and we've had some discussion about rules and how to play the game, so this will be particularly relevant today. Some of the discussions that took place in 1857 at the first meeting of the newly found National Association of Baseball Players. They had a big meeting of clubs, and the assumption was that the Knickerbockers had been where they were using the Knickerbockers rules. So as a lot of the rules that had not really been firmly nailed down at that point were being now formalized, that the Knickerbockers would take the lead role. A lot of people thought that way. But in fact, when the meeting happened, something very different happened. Even though it had been said in advance that the Knickerbocker Club was going to take the lead in proposing the necessary reforms, it turned out that they did indeed propose some reforms, but they weren't exactly accepted with with anything like unanimity. A committee from that club sat down, compiled what was called a code of rules in which they clearly defined every point in the game with a view to making the game more manly and scientific. They brought the rules to the meeting, and the logical next step, if this was the Knickerbockers game and they were inventing it, the logical next step was for everybody else to rubber stamp them. Instead, part by part, they were discussed and in many cases rejected. The Knickerbocker Committee had recommended 7 innings to be the basis of competition. But this was amended in convention on the motion of Mr. Wadsworth to 9 innings. Well, Mr. Wadsworth, Louis Wadsworth, was also a prominent member of the Knickerbocker Club, and so at least a club member was taking part in the change. But the fact that they had not, the officially proposed proposal of 7 innings had been rejected was a clear sign that baseball was belonging not to a small group, but to everybody who played it. Strike 1 for the Knickerbockers. Next rule. The Knickerbockers also proposed that strikers might have the privilege of squaring down the round bat or club if they desired to play with a flat face instead of the uncertain round club. This is going to change baseball fundamentally if this goes through. And people were not happy about this. This would take away one of the fundamental distinctions between baseball and cricket if you allow batters to use square bats. Well, the only description, and some of the debates were described in great detail. The description simply said this was not adopted. Strike 2 for the Knickerbockers. A third proposed rule showed that no longer were the members, were the various clubs even interested in sparing the feelings of the Knickerbockers. The Knickerbockers had decided that they wanted to do away with the bound rule, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and I'm glad I don't have to explain the bound rule to a group, which I usually do. So not only when this was debated, not only was there vocal opposition to doing away with the bound rule from many of the clubs, but the opponents did not hesitate in accusing the advocates of the rules of trying to turn their American sport into a British sport. If Englishmen choose to hurt their hands by catching the ball before it touches the grounds, why should Americans do so? Asked one delegate. After listening to many complaints by many members that such a rule would inflict too much pain on the fielders and would turn baseball into being too much like cricket, it became obvious that the room was evenly divided. Accordingly, quote, the advocates of the reform finally acceded to a proposition of their opponents, namely that if a man was caught out before the ball touched the ground, that then the players who were running to the different bases or home could neither make an ace nor base, but had to return to their original position. This was certainly a greater inducement to a display of nerve on the part of the fielders, as by the former rules the players could make as many aces or bases as they pleased if the ball was taken on the mound. This was adopted unanimously. This was a compromise, a spirit of compromise, but as far as the idea of the Knickerbockers simply deciding what the rules were going to be, it was strike 3 for the Knickerbockers. This was thus a historic moment for the new game. It was showing that the game would never again belong to the Knickerbocker Club or indeed to any small closed circle, which happened with a lot of sports. Think of there was always movements to turn horse racing into having a jockey club. Cricket was dictated by how was it called, the Marylebone? Marylebone. Okay, thanks for that. One of those words I see in print a lot. Marylebone. Boxing was, a set of rules. Baseball was going to have a set of rules, but they were going to be debated, and every American wanted a part of this. This was a creation of a dynamic process in which everybody who played baseball expected that because this was a new sport, this was an American sport, and in particular because this was the national pastime, that they wanted to have a say in it, and they demanded to have a say in it. What an Englishman can do, according to one account, What an Englishman can do, an American is capable of improving upon. And this reflected the fact that the 1850s was a time of chaos in America for many reasons. Obviously, the onset, the approaching Civil War. And in sports, no less so than any other area. And in fact, after 20 years of the Industrial Revolution really having hit Americans hard, Americans coming to the city, all these developments that are fundamentally changing America, the telegraph, the railroad, everything moving faster, things are very unsettled, and Americans are looking for national symbols. And there becomes a real consensus that America needs a national sport to address a fundamental issue. That in these growing cities, the young bachelors who are having their own quarter, are increasingly young bachelors who are having their own quarter, their own area of the city, and these areas are filled with saloons, they're filled with brothels, they're filled with a lot of other things that I'm sure you can imagine that young men tend to do when they're unattached. And other members of the city with more conventional, more traditional views are saying, we need to bring these young people back into, activities that are more socially acceptable. We need a sport that everybody can play, that could become a national pastime. And yet when people looked at this and people said, well, what sport would be suitable for this? There really wasn't even a decent candidate. People looked at the two sports that were where you can see signs of tremendous popularity are horse racing and boxing. But boxing was very event oriented. Every so often there'd be a big fight and people get very excited about it, but it had no ongoing popularity. Horse and boxing, moreover, it was the sport for the bachelors. It was associated with violence, obviously, out and out violence. It was associated with gambling. It was associated with a lot of things that just were never going to appeal to traditionalists. Horse racing also had these ties to gambling that made it very difficult a very difficult sell to most Americans. It was also not a sport that was particularly made a lot of sense in these new cities. It was a sport that was associated with the countryside. It was a sport that was part of the farmer's life. But as Americans moved to the cities, horses were increasingly not a part of their regular life. So neither one of these made sense as a national sport. And there was basically a very strong sense. And so baseball pretty much became the sport. After they looked and they said, well, there were these violent sports on one hand. On the other hand, upholders of traditional morality said, well, we could have sailing, we could have rowing, we could have walking contests. Those are nice. Well, you can imagine young men weren't really that excited about walking contests. Archery, cricket, these didn't really excite people. And then sailing and rowing. What's the biggest problem with sailing and rowing as a national sport? There's several, but what's the obvious? Yeah,
Money and water.
Spectators and the rich can dominate them. The rich person buys the best boat, and they're going to win. And so these aren't sports that have a lot of a kind of universality that you can have for a national sport. The result was that by 1856, Americans were starting to call baseball their national sport. But one of the things I've really come to realize, a lot of explanations started to be written about why baseball was the national pastime. A lot of people said, well, it fits the American temperament, and it's a lot of wonderful things. Here's one of the more highfalutin explanations. Baseball requires intellectual culture with a good nature, etc., that result from it. To be able to play a game of baseball properly, there is something artistic, there is something scientific in a game of baseball. Grace may attend the capture of a ball, the manipulation of a bat, or the running of the baselines. The silent play of science is to profit by position, to measure distance, and to poise the ball properly on its winged way. The enjoyment to be derived from the perception of its science and its art is the highest object of the game. Have any of you ever gone home and said, you know, I had a great game today because of the perception of science? and we were able to poise the ball properly on its winged way.
Yes, of course. Doesn't everyone?
Probably not. Here's an explanation that I like a little better. This is a character in a novel who says, who describes a project of mine to replace the tournament with something which might furnish an escape from the extra steam of the chivalry, keep those bucks entertained and out of mischief, and at the same time preserve the best thing in them, which was their hearty spirit of emulation. This experiment was baseball. Do I know what novel that is? Mark Twain, Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. And what he's saying is not that baseball is this, marvelous, somehow wonderfully akin with the American spirit, but it's a way to keep bucks entertained and out of mischief. And that was a much more general understanding of baseball. It was, it really wasn't perfect, but if we work on this, we negotiate enough about how to play, we can come up with a way that the bachelors will find it exciting enough, and it'll keep them from getting into worse kinds of trouble. And yet the minister of the church can also not be completely offended by it. Here's Harry Palmer's explanation, and I think this is a good one. Because it does point out some positive points, but it also suggests that baseball was at heart that it was a necessary evil. Harry Palmer said, the game of baseball owes its popularity in a large measure to those elements in it which are identical with the crowning characteristics of the average American. Clean, vigorous, honest, and spiced with just enough of the element of risk and danger to make it intensely interesting. Baseball presents none of the tiresome features of cricket, as played under established rules, is free from the demoralizing effect of the pool blocks and the bookmaker that makes many shun the racetrack, has none of the roughness of football, as demonstrated in many a college game upon record, presents no opportunity for juggling, sellouts, and crooked work, and is today governed and controlled in the majority by men of high social and business reputation who could not, for obvious reasons, afford to identify their names with an enterprise of questionable character. So in essence, what he said is, it has some nice qualities, but what's really important is it's not as bad as these other sports. And a lot of accounts had this very strong sense. The Clinton Republican from just north of where I live in St. John's, Michigan, in 1866, said the game of baseball is a decided institution, and we may safely say a beneficial one, as apart from the muscular exercise necessary to the game, it tends to keep young men away from places where far more objectionable sports are indulged in. It's a necessary evil. It has some benefits, but at heart, it's a necessary evil. And the Ionia County Sentinel, also from mid-Michigan. Baseball will be more beneficial than loafing on the street corners or around saloons. As a result, baseball was taken as a national pastime, but very much on a conditional basis, very much with a sense that a series of balance and compromises were going to be necessary to ensure that it didn't fall into the traps, didn't become the evils that were associated with these other sports, didn't become too violent, didn't become too tied to gambling, didn't become so that a rich person could simply buy the result. And the result was a series of negotiations that begin basically in 1857, what I described, when the other conventioneers say, no, we're not going to let the Knickerbockers make all the rules, and we're certainly not going to let anybody turn this game into cricket. We want an American game with rules that we debated and decided on democratically. And I would argue that over the next 50 years, those negotiations continue. And I believe that those negotiations are at the heart of vintage baseball. That, to me, is what makes it not just a sort of an old-timey thing, like if we were to recreate vintage basketball and put balls in the peach baskets and then have to climb up on a ladder and get them out, or vintage hockey where we'd stop the play all the time. But it makes it about a series of important negotiations about how do we make sure that this game represents all Americans, includes all Americans as much as we can. And of course, it didn't include African Americans. It didn't do a great job of including women, and didn't always do a great job of including a lot of other groups. But what was important was that there was a democratic process going on, and so Americans could say, this is at least it's trying. It's a national game. And to me, the 150 years since have redounded, or have that's not the right word. Over the 150 years, there's one example after another of Americans looking at baseball and expecting it to be the national pastime, keeping it to a higher standard. How many people have heard somebody say, well, I lost interest in baseball because of steroids? And yet, is baseball the only major sport with a steroid problem? And yet, baseball, it seems that people get upset about steroids in baseball in a way that they don't with other sports, because we hold it to a higher standard, and we expect baseball to be accessible to all Americans. We expect what we see on the field to reflect what's going on, to be real and to not be tainted by behind the scenes shenanigans of any sort. Same thing with labor trouble. Every major sport has had labor trouble, and yet I've heard dozens and dozens of people say, well, I lost interest in baseball after the strike. They went on strike, they canceled the World Series, that was it. They were overpaid ball players, I'm never going to watch baseball again. And yet I've never heard anybody say that about football, which has had major labor. Hockey lost an entire season. I don't know anybody who would even say that. But people say that about baseball. Why? Well, baseball became a business then. Well, baseball became a business in the late 1860s, but it's hard to argue who say that. They want to say, well, baseball went on strike. That was it for me. People hold baseball to a very high standard. We expect it to be the national pastime. And in a sense, and as I've tried to suggest, that's really what vintage baseball, I think, can really represent. On the field, we're trying to have a high level of play, a high level of gentlemanly conduct, but there's always a sense that there's this. Okay, let's figure out how are we going to make the rules in such a way that everybody can play. And let me just go through some of the important elements in which baseball in the late 19th century, starting in the vintage period, but in some cases going on for many years afterwards, was a search for this kind of balance. There was a search to keep the game moving, to not having players stand around as in cricket. And again, baseball wanted to distinguish itself from cricket. Cricket could go on for more than one day. There was a break to have tea. Baseball players, it's hard to believe when we see the 21st century, but baseball in the mid-19th century was a very fast game, very rapid-paced game. And delays, people would get very upset about this. Chicago paper in 1879, the Inter-Ocean, had this to say: a little advice to the players. The game yesterday was too long. It could have been played 40 minutes quicker. After the average lover of baseball has watched a game for 2 hours, and the hands begin to hurry on towards 6 o'clock, because games, of course, were played then in the late afternoon, because they didn't have night baseball. He begins to think of his boarding house and an impatient landlady, and almost vows he'll never come again. Now today, don't be so slow coming to the bat. Don't walk so slow when taking positions in the outfield at the close of the inning. Don't wait so long for a broken finger. Play with more briskness in every way. This is more than half the charm of the game. Since that newspaper writer clearly thought that he had the right and indeed the obligation to tell people they weren't playing the game right. This is our game. This is my game. I have a stake in this game. Americans felt that they were stakeholders in baseball and that they had a right to say, to object when it wasn't being played right. There was a long, complicated process of trying to find a balance between a high-scoring game and a low-scoring game. Of course, vintage era, we have very high-scoring games, 60 to 50. It's not a typical game. But by 1870, you suddenly started to have 1-0 games as the dead ball came in, and people were, well, what's the right balance? About the 1880s, by the end of the 1870s, it's gone up again, goes up the 1880s, goes up and down, but mostly up in the 1890s. Then the start of the 20th century goes dramatically down with the spitball and the change of the foul rule. So there's this search. Is baseball supposed to be a high-scoring game or a low-scoring game? And people spent a lot of time arguing about this, and every rule change that was made was designed to either make it a higher-scoring game or a lower-scoring game, and was based upon the sense that, no, baseball should be, 25 to 20 is not a good score, let's get it lower. Then they get it lower, and then too many 2-1 games, it's boring, let's get a little balance. And so there's 20 years of this. When the fair foul rule was changed, Harry Wright said, this will equalize the batting and fielding. So sense a need to equalize batting and fielding, and also tend to lessen the discretionary power of the umpire, and relieve him of the responsibilities now resting upon him. This in turn created the need for a balance in which the pitcher and catcher didn't dominate, in which it needed to be a game in which all 9 players had a role. In 1875, a letter from a fan, and again, fans felt that they had a role in the game. A fan wrote in 1875, professional clubs or their managers seem to forget that the spectators paid for admission and desired to see the whole 9 performing and not merely 2 of their players. An old-timer a few years later said, baseball ain't what it used to be. The leather twirlers of today attempt to play the whole game for themselves. So a very strong sense that baseball needed to have all 9 players playing. And this was a huge issue throughout the 19th century. How do we do this? How do we keep the pitchers from getting too many strikeouts? And how do we keep all the players involved? And this is still a very important issue today. Anybody who's seen kids are often find sport like soccer more interesting, because even when they don't touch the ball, they're sort of running around after the ball. And baseball, you're the right fielder, and the ball doesn't come to you in the right field, you're just standing there. And so that's an important issue in the 19th century, still an important issue today. And the various times where the pitcher was moved back, the pitchers moved back 5 feet in 1880, and then it's moved back 5 feet again in 1893, when the current distance of 60 feet 6 inches comes in to play. And all this was based on a sense that among many, that the pitcher was trying to turn the sport into a different kind of sport than what everybody thought it should be. It was originally, the pitcher was supposed to be basically lobbing, giving the batter a pitch that he could hit, and by the 1870s he's trying to strike the batter out. And in the 1860s, a strikeout was considered really a very disappointing play at best. It suggested a complete failure by the batter. But as pitchers are throwing harder, and all of a sudden they're trying to turn the game into something else. And it's almost akin to if you go to a coach pitch league today, and instead of the coach just trying to give the poor little batter something that he can hit, all of a sudden he's boom, I struck him out. And a lot of pitchers looked at the pitch. A lot of baseball fans looked at pitchers in that way, like, this is some nut who thinks he can strike my kid out. Of course he can strike my kid out. He's a big, he's a grown man. He's an idiot. And that's my next. That leads into my next point, which is baseball sought a balance between the pleasures of being a boy and teaching those boys lessons about manhood. And this is the way in which baseball sort of became a baseball. Baseball became a game about fathers and sons. If adults could sort of justify, again, this is more adults with more traditional, but any adult who cares about their kids and brings their kids, teaches their kids baseball, wants to feel that there's a lesson going on. So here's Henry Chadwick lecturing. If you miss a fly ball, allow an important ball to pass you, or fail to handle a ball in time on a base, nothing is more boyish than to vent your ill temper on someone who may have balked you in catching it, or thrown it to you badly. And here's a newspaper account from 1879. We did not expect that the other team would snivel and act like a parcel of school children. So then, as now, there's no crying in baseball. Baseball had to find a balance over violence. As I've mentioned, many of the sports that were popular in the first half of the 19th century were very violent. Boxing was a very violent sport. And a lot of the sports were animal sports that would be disgusting to us today, and they condoned violence in ways that most people found offensive, or at least many people found offensive. And so baseball had to find a way to resolve this while still giving some excitement, and baseball found the perfect way to do that, really, by as everybody who's played vintage baseball knows, there's a real potential for violence when it's the ball bouncing up and hitting you in places, or in you're lucky in your fingers and doing damage there, but in other places. The game has a very real potential for violence. And there were a lot of people by the end of the 1860s who thought baseball was way too violent. But the rationale that could be used to justify it was, well, it can be pretty violent, and you can certainly do a lot of damage to various parts of your body, but it's the ball doing it, it's the game doing it to it. It's not another player isn't going up and hitting you. There's no violent attacks. So it teaches kids, well, you gotta be tough, you gotta be manly, you can't cry every time the ball, it gives a little nick. And you have to learn a skillful way to handle it, to prevent the violence from happening to you. But at the same time, the violent interactions they're not aggression. They're not the result of somebody going up and hitting somebody else. Baseball needed to find a balance between speed and power, and different skill sets. The sense that you don't have to be a giant, as in football and basketball, to play the game, and that's always been an important part. And one of the reasons I think that people get so upset about steroids, the extent that now you have to be super muscle bound to play baseball. That's one of the things that upsets. And in the early days, there was a lot of talk about of matches between a large, powerful, muscular team against a small, young, wiry, active team. And the assumption was that the large, powerful, muscular team was going to win, but it didn't always happen. Sometimes the small, young, wiry, active team was able to steal bases and play better defense and do a lot of things that allow a man of a smaller stature to sometimes beat one. This is not a tug-of-war contest, but this was a game in which a lot of different skills could be brought to the fore. A balance over gambling needed to be found. A balance over professionalism needed to be found. And this came up right from the start. Many people thought that as professionalism started to come into the game, this was the end of the world. Just as people would say, well, the strike, baseball became a business today. But in the early 1860s, there's a very lively debate about, is professionalism the end of the world? And many people said this is going to ruin baseball. Baseball is no longer being played for the love of it. It's no longer being played by amateurs. It's being played by professionals who don't care about, who aren't playing for their home city. They're representing some other city, and so on and so on. And we've all heard these arguments. But there's a compelling argument the other direction. If you don't if you don't say, well, you can get some compensation, you can at least get time off work to baseball players, then baseball is going to be dominated by the rich. The poor really can't afford to play if there's no compensation at all. So if you have a strictly amateur game, and this argument was made by the early 60s, people would say, well, maybe we don't want to pay the players, but we should at least compensate them from the days they miss from work because they can't play otherwise. And that sounds like an equally reasonable argument. So there was a balance over professionalism, over, well, maybe we don't, maybe the idea of paying people to play baseball is something we're going to struggle with. But on the other hand, if you don't have any kind of compensation, then essentially you're saying, well, this is going to be a sport for the rich. And then it's not a sport for all Americans, is it? A balance between the city and the country had to be found. One account described how the agile city player was the player who devises new tricks, and while the big, good-humored farmhand takes the umpire's decisions silently. There were a lot of stereotypes, a lot of discussion about is baseball, does it still, its roots are in the country, but now it's moved to the city, it's taken all these characteristics of a city sport. Is it changing baseball? And so there's a lot of discussion about this. How do we find a balance? Can baseball be between the country and the city? And this continues on to the 20th century when people take great pleasure in a guy like Dizzy Dean, who mangles the English language and enjoys being a country bumpkin, and this has a great appeal that there's still a role for the country player, and we can think of players up to this day who sort of bring back the idea that, hey, there are still some just regular country guys can play baseball. That's an important sense. And one of the first clubs to take advantage of this was the Unions of Lansingburg, New York, and they're mostly Irish players from a gritty industrial town on the outskirts of Troy. But they were also, because they were the outskirts, they were also a lot of them were farming their land. So there was a kind of a balance between that. And when they went to New York City to play one of the best teams in the country, the Mutuals, their big city rivals just thought, well, these are just a bunch of country bumpkins, and the Unions not only beat them, but they earned a nickname. They became known as the Haymakers of Troy because they were thought of as this little team of country bumpkins. And after they got this nickname of becoming called the Haymakers of Troy, instead of protesting and saying, well, we're really not that from the country, they created a club logo which had a pitchfork displayed prominently, and they began bringing farm implements to the games. They were widely known as the Haymakers of Troy, and one of the players, Mark King, refused to wear shoes or a cap while he played, really in defiance of a lot of the traditions of the game. Delighted crowds turned out in droves to watch the team. They were the one team that had a blemish on the 1869 Red Stockings. Everybody knows the 1869 Red Stockings were undefeated, but they had a tie with the Haymakers of Troy, and a lot of people say the Troy team left in the game, which is true, but there's a lot of I think there's a good basis for feeling that they were getting royally the wrong side of the lot of calls from the hometown umpire, and and they had good reason to. So that game was considered a tie, and it was the only blemish on the 1869 Red Stockings record. Baseball had to find all of these balances in order to solidify its role as a national pastime. And I hope that as vintage players, you're seeing some of the negotiations that go on in the play, some of the efforts that you all make to show baseball as a gentleman's game, but also it's a gentleman's game in which the spirit of competitiveness comes out from time to time, and I'm sure everybody can think of times where there's been a struggle. Well, we're trying to show us a gentleman's game, but boy, I really thought I was safe, and I want to protest that. A balance over alcohol had to be found, and it took the major leagues until well into the 20th century, and even then, a tenuous compromise. Again, a series of negotiations and compromises. Balance between members of the first nine and the second nine. Are the first nine going to play all the games, and the second nine just going to watch? Second nine going to pay the same for membership? One early club said, well, we should at least get uniforms for the second nine. It must not be forgotten that they are of as much importance as the first nine. But it was easy to forget that all of the players wanted to be members of the club, and yet if only 9 played, then what was their role? Hugely important role for women. That's very important not to forget, and that I think vintage clubs do a good job of making sure to show this. But I think it's very important to remember that all early clubs and newspapers would constantly harp on the presence of women, because women were considered to have a purifying influence on the men. They would at least stop the men from swearing, but they would ensure that the sport was played in the spirit that it was meant to be played. And there were constant descriptions of how it has hitherto been the greatest drawback to the popularity of sports and pastimes in this country that ladies have been prohibited by the religious customs of American society in this respect from being spectators at any trial of skill in those manly games and exercises which in England are countenanced by the fairest of Britain's nobility. But women were highly desired to be at the games. Newspapers covered the games if women were there. If women were not there, they tended not to. They tended to think, well, this is just turning back into one of these bachelor sports that doesn't really do any credit to us as a society. If women are attending and women are giving their support to the sport, then that shows that that the process of trying to make sure that this game is inclusive is working. And of course, the other person who had a huge important role was the umpire. Umpires, as you know, and again, this is one of the things I have to explain to a lot of people, but as umpires were treated as dignitaries in early baseball. They were essentially there to make sure that things didn't go wrong. But as by the 1870s, they're being expected to make every call. By the 1880s, the number of calls are increasing, and the reaction to them is becoming more and more harsh. And by the 1890s, not only are umpires being subjected to violent attacks, but the National League is continuing to expect one umpire to see all of the play going on all over the baseball field. And my favorite example of this is in 1894, the National League, there was a lot of movement to, well, you need at least 2 umpires. You got base runners all over the place. And one umpire cannot call balls and strikes and call plays at first, second, and third all at the same time. Well, the National League responded to this in 1894 by hiring an umpire named Billy Stage, who was a college student. And what made Billy Stage interesting was Billy Stage had recently recently matched the world record in the 100-yard dash. So as a result, batter would hit the ball, run to first, and the umpire would run would run past him and get there before him and be waiting for him when he get to first base to call him safe or out. The double, he'd be going there. And if there were 2 or 3 runners, this Philly stage would just be running all over the field, out racing, trying to get to the bases before, so he'd have a good view of the action. So clearly the umpire's role had changed, but a very important role, and from the start, from going to being somebody who was just ceremonial, to making decisions, to having to listen to calls of judgment and how's that, and having to respond, he becomes the person who has to essentially embody this whole thing, this whole idea that baseball is becoming a sport of compromise, a sport of negotiations, a sport of consensus, and that this is what is making it the national pastime. And I think umpires are incredibly unsung heroes of 19th century baseball. And so finally, we have a situation, in conclusion, let me say that what we have over the course of the 19th century is baseball develops into a sport in which it earns its reputation as a national pastime by showing that, not perfectly and not ideally in every case, but it's making a real effort to give everybody a say and to give everybody influence, to make fans feel that they can write letters to the editor saying, hey, here's a change we should make. And somebody might listen to them. To make sports writers feel that they can write and say, well, baseball needs to do this better, and some chance. In 1896, Clark Griffith talked about the intentional walk, and he said, well, the crowd is not in sympathy with any pitcher who is not game enough to let any batter hit the ball at the same time depending on his own ability. So he essentially didn't ever issue intentional walks because the fans would get on it. He recognized that, no, it's the fans' game, and this is how I'm going to play it. 1875, an umpire named Alphonse Martin read the rule book as early umpires did. 1875, this was now a bit of a novelty, but there was a difficult play. He got a rule book out and started to read it. And spectators began to holler, read it out loud, and pass it around, and let us all read it. I said, this is becoming everybody's game. We don't just want to have one guy going through the rule book and making rule. Read it out loud. We all want to be part of this. The New York Clipper, Henry Chadwick, writing in the New York Clipper in 1876, some batsmen who have not the moral courage to play their own game without regard to the comments of the crowd are very apt to be intimidated into a reckless style of hitting for fear of being considered a waiter at the bat. It is no discredit to him to take his base on called balls under such circumstances. But clearly, fans are having an influence on batters in that way. And many accounts say that if a batter, another account said that if a batter stood and waited too long, the crowd would jeer and fellow players would shame him. And finally, the slide, another interesting topic. According to one account, when slides started to become really popular in the 1880s, the Philadelphia athletic management said that it would insist on its men getting their clothes dirty by the sliding process. Sliding thus became popular with fans. Fans said, well, it shows that the player is becoming an all-out hustler, wants to win, and so sliding became popular, even though there were many in the 1880s who thought that sliding should be banned, that it was dirty play because of spikes involved, that it was not a sportsmanlike play. But ultimately, the fact that the fans liked it is why it became a permanent part of baseball, and really as good example as I can give. So I think we've come full circle. I hope that this brings us, this shows why that important confrontation in 1857, in which the other clubs that were invited to the NABBP convention didn't go along with everything the Knickerbockers said, and in fact were very pointed in their complaints that the Knickerbockers were trying to turn baseball into something too much like cricket. why that was a very important moment for baseball. It started a wonderfully dynamic process that was repeated over the next 50 years, and that I believe is what is also recreated by vintage baseball. And I hope that you'll agree with me that that's worth a huzzah.
Huzzah!
Thank you.